Hey, welcome back everybody. This is the next segment of the LS1 build, and you can see what we got going on here. All this performance camshaft business here. So the next step is we're going to install the camshaft in the engine. So this cam is really not all that radical. If we look at the cam card here, this cam is about 550 lift, and the duration at 50 is 204, 218. Not a crazy big cam. In fact, it's not really the optimal cam that you would want for the best horsepower level. It does have a lobe separation of 120 degrees, so it's really wide lobe sep, which is pretty typical for an LS motor. But the customer in this situation did not want to have to do a bunch of computer tuning. Now, here's a disclaimer. A lot of times it will say on the cam card, no computer tuning. And my experience has been that GM has a bunch of different tunes on their computers for these engines. And sometimes even when it says that, you still got to do some tuning on that computer. So, but this cam does say right in the paperwork and the literature that it doesn't require tuning. So, yeah, it's about 550 lift, and it's got 204 intake duration and 218 exhaust duration with a wide lobe separation. So, but it should do pretty good in the LS motor. I've used this cam before, and they're pretty decent for an LS engine that you want to run really good on the street, but don't want to do a lot of major tuning and stuff too. So the next step is to install this turkey. Of course, you want to put your assembly lube on there. Don't put these in dry, and you want to go in real gentle with these. We don't want to damage these new bearings or have any issues with it like that. And of course, I like to leave the plug out in the back, you guys. And that way I can reach in back here in this hole, and you can see I can grab the cam back there and just kind of help guide it into that rear bearing. Just like that. And there, that is your cam installation. And then of course, once we get the cam in, of course, the next step is we want to put the cam plate on here. Then we'll just go ahead and put our cam plate / oil gallery cover on here. This is going to, there's an embedded seal in here, and it just takes the 4 bolts here. Torque your bolts to the specified. So just go ahead and get your plate torqued up there, and then we can move on to the next step. The cam in, I always like to put the camshaft position sensor in there. We put a new O-ring on it, and also make sure you put oil on this. You don't want to put this in dry, and this just fits right down in there. And then you get your retaining bolt on there and torque it. You don't need a lot of torque on this. It's about 20 foot-pounds. Doesn't take much. But make sure that that sensor is actually seated before you actually torque it. Just give it about 20 foot-pounds and you're in business. Now is a good time to put the timing chain on. We'll go back to the front of the motor, and also we have a gear that has to go on there as well. Alright guys, so for timing chain installation, it's really not any different than the earlier small block Chevy. It's basically dot to dot. So I've got the piston at top dead center here, and my dot right here is at 12 o'clock. And I'm just going to go ahead and put this gear on temporarily and I just get a bolt started in it. And that way you can go ahead and get your cam at 6 o'clock. And right now I am at 12 and 6 right there. So that's where the cam needs to be located. And then at that point, we can just hang our chain on there. And we also changed this gear too. There's a puller, special puller for this, and a pressing tool. I didn't do that on camera because that's probably something that you're going to have a machine shop do for you. Just have them press that gear off and on for you. The tools are just, they're prohibitively expensive. I mean, you can rent them and do it. It's pretty self-explanatory, but it's best just to have a shop do that for you. So you want to get that lined up dot to dot, and that should fall right on your pin there. And then we'll go ahead and get our bolts started. So I suppose I should give you guys a heads up on the bolt torque here. The retaining plate that goes on the cam, guys, underneath the gallery plug plate, block off plate, and a retaining plate for the cam is 18 foot-pounds. The torque on your cam bolts here is 26 foot-pounds according to GM. So you want to make sure that you get these torqued to the correct torque spec. The engine might turn, but that's okay. Usually won't turn too much. There we go. So yeah, just make sure you get those torqued to the proper spec and everything will be fine. And then you want to verify, make sure that you're still dot to dot. This moves, so I'm going to back it up just a little bit. And my cam timing here is dot to dot, so we're good. Now the next step is we want to get that oil pump on. So the oil pump, you guys, is keyed onto the crank. So this is our milling oil pump. The part number is M295. And they also give you some O-rings along with it that are going to go with the pickup tube. So I want to make sure that you use that, and I'll show you that here in a minute. Now I've got the bolt in here to turn the crank. This is a crank bolt. You don't actually have to take that off to put the pump on this thing. The oil gallery is right here, and it lines up with the pump. And that's just a metal to metal deal. There's no gasket that goes in there. Now another thing is, you never want to put this pump on dry. You always want to pre-lubricate it. So I like to just take and get some oil into the pump here. And I will kind of turn that gear in there to actuate that pump. Just make sure it's not dry, and I can hear the oil kind of squeezing through that thing there, and that's really what you're after. Now I've got oil all the way up to the, I'm turning this and I've got oil all the way up to the pickup here. It's kind of messy, but you just want to make sure that these gears are lubricated. And we got a drip tray here. Some of that's going to spill out when I put this on, but that's okay, as long as I got lube in there. And then of course this is keyed on, and you may have to rotate the crank, which is not a big deal. We want to go ahead and just kind of let that gear locate itself. So we're just going to rotate the crank around till that pump basically just falls down on the crank. There it goes, it just fell down onto the key. And then we just line the pump up to the block there, and you can see the bolt holes lined up. And when there are bolt holes in it, we'll get our bolts in and torque them to specs, and that's your... Okay guys, so while we're on the subject of the oil pump, there's something that we kind of need to look at here. This is our factory pickup tube, and if you look at some of the literature, like I'm reading what Melling says here, and there's two styles of pickups on these engines. There's two different O-rings depending on the design. So the OE O-ring that was red is going to require us to use the green melling oil ring that came with the pump. If the OE O-ring was blue, then we need to use Melling's black oil pump. They give O-ring. They give you two different O-rings. So if we take a look at our pickup tube, this is why you always want to save these old parts. Our pickup tube has a blue O-ring on it. So according to Melling, we're going to take that off. We need to use the black O-ring on this. So we're just going to take our black O-ring and put it on there. You don't want to use the green one, because that was only if the OEM, if it had the other OEM O-ring. Okay, so we got our black one on there. We're going to put a little bit of oil on that O-ring. We're going to lubricate it. Now, before we put this on though, we got to put our windage tray on. This is what's known by most of us as a windage tray. GM calls this the oil deflector, and it goes toward the back of the engine. You want to position that on the engine and get the nuts started on there. Alright, now I want you guys to take note of something here. If you look at this oil pump, the pickup screen only has a retainer with one bolt in it, and you'll notice there are two bolt holes in that oil pump. Don't worry about that. That's normal. In fact, the GM pump from the factory has two holes in it, and it only has one retainer. Why they did that, I don't know. But you can see where this thing goes. There's a couple of these windage tray or oil shield nuts that are going to actually accept this pickup tube. Okay, so you want to get all these started before you tighten anything up. We also want to get our oil pump retaining bolt in there and torque it. Alright, so we've got our pickup screen on. We got the two support nuts on for the support locations, and then we've got our bolt in here. You want to go ahead and tighten, go ahead and get that O-ring down in there, kind of push it down in there, and as you kind of hold that down in, just put this in finger tight, and that'll kind of hold that O-ring in. And you want to torque that bolt to spec. The torque on that bolt is 106 inch-pounds. You want to be careful tightening that thing. It's not much. You don't want to snap that bolt off or strip the threads. So make sure you torque it with an inch-pound torque wrench. The retaining nuts for the windage tray or the oil shield are 18 foot-pounds. Alright, so we've got our windage tray bolts torqued. We've got our oil pump bolt torqued here to 106 inch-pounds, and we are rocking and rolling. Now I'll demonstrate how to put the pan on this engine, but actually the customer doesn't want the pan on because he's using a special pan for his application. So I think I'm going to go ahead and flip it back over, and we're going to talk about the cylinder heads and the lifters and so forth. Those are pretty straightforward. And then the last thing I think we're going to do is we're going to do the timing cover and the rear cover. So the engine covers are actually the most critical part of putting this engine together. You got to have some special tools to get those seals centered. If you don't do it that way, you're going to have leaks. So we have a special toolkit here, and I'm going to walk you when we get to it how to put those covers on. But right now I want to flip it over and talk about the valve tray, the cylinder heads and the valve tray. Alright guys, so the next step on the LS engines, one thing that's real important to remember is you got to put the lifters in before the heads go on. You can't get to them otherwise. Now we've got our new lifters in here, and you can see I've got them in clean engine oil. Now I can't stress enough how important it is, and this gets a little bit messy, that you soak roller style lifters. Roller style. Now, not flat tappets. Now, I see all these YouTube videos and stuff where people, they're putting these lifters, flat tappet lifters in oil, and they got a push rod and they're pumping the plunger and they're doing all that stuff. You know, I don't know who came up with that nonsense, but if it's a flat tappet lifter, even if it's hydraulic, you do not have to put them in oil and pump the plunger. That's just complete nonsense. So if you see that in a video, just find a different video, because those guys have no idea what they're doing. We're not submerging these in oil because of the hydraulic mechanism here. That's not the issue. The issue is the needle bearings on the roller, and always make sure you use engine oil only. Never use assembly lube on these, because a thick assembly lube is going to be too thick on that bearing, and so the roller is actually not going to roll. The assembly lube will stop it from rolling, and now you're going to have your cam sliding on that roller. The cam will overspeed the roller, and that's going to wipe the roller out. So never a thick assembly lube, light engine oil only. Soak them for a good amount of time. I've had these in there for an hour or so. It's plenty long enough. And then on the LS engine, of course, we have the neoprene. I never did like the plastic retainers until I researched how GM made these. These things are actually pretty strong. And so we just want to take each set of 4 lifters, and again, it's a little messy when you take them out of the oil, but that's okay. A little bit of engine oil draining there down there on the camshaft is not going to hurt anything. Just go ahead and get your first 4 lifters in the first anti-rotator in the neoprene bracket, and that slot right there's a flat slot. It fits into that flat slot there. It pops in there, and that's what keeps this lifter from spinning. Okay, now that you've got that set of lifters in, you just go ahead and take your retainer. It's very simple. You just slide those lifters very carefully into the lifter bore. You got to kind of work them in, but they will go down in there. Just gently tap them in, and that's your lifter retainer. Then you want to go ahead and put your retaining bolt on. That holds this thing in place. That's your guide. And we're going to torque that to specs. Now you're going to repeat that. You've got 4 sets of 4 here. So we're going to do these 4, and then we're going to do the other 2 on the other side. I won't do all that on camera because 1 is good enough for a demo, but I'll go ahead and get the rest of them in and get these bolts torqued up off camera, and then we'll come back and start talking about our cylinder heads. Alright, so we've got all of our lifters installed and got the retainers torqued down. These are our Felpro head gaskets, and you got a couple of dowel pins on the block here. You want to make sure both these dowel pins are in. And these gaskets are directional, guys. So you can see you got a pattern on one side. On one side the pattern's going to be up, and then the other side the pattern's going to be down. And here's why. Right here, I don't know how well you can see it, but it says front. So there is a front and a back. So on this bank, I mean, if we put it on like this, the word front's going to be back here, and that is no good. So this one here goes like this with the word front obviously in the front of the engine. So just get it on your dowel pins, and then of course on the other side it's flipped around this way, and the pattern, the blue pattern, is going to be up. It doesn't matter which way the gasket goes as far as this goes, but it does matter front to back. So if you look on this one, we've got the word front right here. So we're going to go ahead and put it on like that, and that's going to have our blue pattern up. So that's the way that the Felpro gaskets go on these engines. And so once you get your lifters in, your retainers in and torqued, basically it's just a matter of putting the cylinder head on and torquing the bolts to specs. Now, the cylinder head bolts are torqued to yield like we talked about earlier in the series. We are going to go ahead and we're going to use ARP fasteners for this engine. So we got ourselves an ARP bolt kit here for the LS1. Now remember, the factory bolts are torqued to yield. You can't reuse them. They're one-time use only. I personally like to upgrade these bolts. I think that the factory bolts on these LS engines are kind of wimpy, personally. That's just me. And I mean, you know, full disclosure, there are guys that have reused those head bolts and had pretty good success with them. Matt Happel does it a lot. And they do work, but if I'm building something for somebody else, I'm not going to do that. If I was building something for me, I may do that. But something that's got to go in a customer's car, we're going to go with ARPs. Okay? So, And also remember, the LS has really long head bolts. There's actually two different head bolt sets, an early and a late, and some of them had a couple of shorter bolts, some of them had all long bolts. It just depends on the setup that you've got. So we've got the correct head bolt set for this particular year of engine. This is a 2001 or 2002, somewhere in there. And now it's just a matter of getting your cylinder heads on the engine. So I like to take a couple of bolts and put them in the head. Now when you put these washers on, make sure that the big chamfer inside goes up. Also, very critical here, we're going to use our ARP lube, and I've talked a lot about this before. You want to get some of that under the head bolt there, between the washer and the head of the bolt, and then a little underneath that washer where it contacts the head. And then of course you want to put some of this, get this on the threads here, really important. So we're going to do that to a couple of these bolts, and then I'm going to go ahead and put them in the cylinder head and use them as guides to guide our cylinder head onto the engine. Now you can see on our cylinder head I've got a couple of the bolts in, and then we're just going to line those bolt holes up, and we're going to set the head on. The nice thing about these heads is they are super light, and it's just really very easy to put these on. Now before you walk away when you do this, you want to get these bolts started in here. Alright you guys, so make sure you get your ARP lube on. Now some of the LS engines required a shorter bolt. If you look at the head bolts on these things, they're super long, and the reason that they designed it that way is they wanted the threaded holes way down in the block away from the top of the cylinder so it wouldn't distort the cylinder. It's actually a really good design. This particular LS takes a shorter bolt on the upper end side. So if you look at the rest of these bolts here, they're really long, but the two shorter bolts are going to go on the end. Now not all of the LS engines, they changed that at a certain year, I'm not sure which one. But some of them actually take the long bolts in every bolt hole. But on our particular engine here, we have to use the shorter bolts on the upper end side. So just get all your bolts in with the ARP lube. Then we can run them down and torque them to specs. You guys, so I've got all the bolts in. Now, one more thing that I would recommend here is get yourself one of these. This is a thread chaser for an LS, and like I said, the head bolt threads are really deep in the block, and they have a tendency to get a little bit of crud and stuff on them. This particular thread chaser is made by ARP, and I bought this. It even says, if you look here, it says ARP on it. I bought this like 15 years ago, and I have probably done 300 of these engines, chased the threads on them, and this thing is still working as good as it did the day I bought it. But that's one issue that you run into if you try to put the head bolts in these without chasing the threads. A lot of times there's some crud and you know, just some boogers down in there that'll screw you up, and it could damage the thread. So make sure you chase the threads really good on every single bolt hole before you put the bolts in. All right, so we've got our ARP fasteners in, we got the ARP lube on them, and now we're gonna torque these guys on. All right, so torquing the bolts, you guys, on the LS1. Now, if you have the factory bolts, you're gonna go to a certain torque, and then you're gonna go a certain number of degrees. When you have ARP bolts, that is not the way you're gonna do it. You gotta follow what ARP says. So what ARP says is, these big bolts out here, the 10 outer bolts, starting here and working your way to the outside, they want you to torque all the fasteners to 25 foot-pounds. Then they want you to go back in sequence to 50 foot-pounds, and then the final torque is 75. Once you get all 10 of these outer bolts torqued to 75 in 3 steps, they want you to come in and, after that's done, torque these inner bolts here to 25 foot-pounds. Right now these are just hand tight. So, and that's the way ARP says to do it. If you're not really sure, you don't remember what I just told you, make sure that you get on ARP's website and figure out, get on ARP's website and get this information for torquing these. I have the torque sequence here on my phone. Alright, here we go. It's 25. Following that sequence. Basically, we're going in a crisscross pattern from front to back. Okay, that's 25. Now we're going to bump it up to 50. All right, and 75. 75 is our final value on these. Again, these are ARP specs. All right, now let's count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right, always go over those and count. Make sure that you didn't miss anything. Now, we'll change our socket. We'll back this back down to 25 foot-pounds, and we're going to torque these inner bolts here. All right, that's it. Head's torqued. Now, I'll go ahead and do the other one off camera. I don't think I need to do both of those, but that's basically it for installing the cylinder heads. Once I get the other one torqued, we'll move on to these covers.